Hey everybody, it's Pastor Will here. If you're just joining us for the first time today, I encourage you to go back and look at our other videos from this week. Today's our third day, our third devotional. This week as we talk about our series, Christ in the Old Testament, and looking at the son of Abraham, ultimately being Isaac, but fulfilled in Christ in the Old Testament. And so in Genesis 22, and I'm not going to read all of Genesis 22 today because it's really long, so I encourage you to go dig into that, to read through Genesis 22. But Abraham is asked to give his son, Isaac, the one that God has promised him, as a sacrifice. He's asked to give his only son. And this may sound familiar to you when you hear this, because in John 3:16 it says that God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And this word that is used here as only son, it doesn't mean that it's Abraham's only son. It means that he's the only one of that kind. Obviously, we know that Abraham had other sons. We know that he's not even Abraham's oldest son, but he is the only son through which the blessing of God is to be passed down. So he's the only son of his kind. And there's so many parallels between Jesus and Isaac. There's so many parallels we see between Jesus and Isaac. We see Abraham as the father who's obedient to God, who's willing to give his son in order to fulfill the promise of God. He's holding nothing back from God. And Isaac, who would have been a grown man at this time, some say between 25 and 37, depending on which historian or scholar you look at, he's carrying the wood for his own sacrifice. Just as we see Christ carrying the cross for his sacrifice, trusting the Father as he's willing to lay down his life as a sacrifice. But we got to think here when we read this passage, what is the author trying to teach us? What is the author of Genesis trying to communicate to his original audience? And I think sometimes we can jump into it and make a moral lesson out of it, that we need to have great faith or endure through hardship or persevere. And the author's not pointing to the perseverance and trust of Abraham. He's pointing to the sovereign plan of God and Abraham's willingness to hold nothing back and trust God completely in his plan. And it shows us that the author is showing us that obedience to God requires absolute surrender and submission. That if we're going to be obedient to God, we can't hold anything back. We have to be willing to give everything we have for his glory, for his purposes. But the overarching theme of Genesis throughout the patriarchs is that God is working through people for his glory. That God is calling people to salvation through human agents who are going as his ambassadors into the world. That God is blessing people through those that he calls. And I don't want us to miss this as we read this in Genesis. That yes, it's important for us to have great faith. Yes, it's important for us to persevere. But the hero of Genesis is God. The hero of this story in Genesis with Abraham is that God has a plan, God has a purpose. And God never intends for Abraham to sacrifice his son. At no point in this story was God ever planning on going through with the sacrifice that Isaac would have died. He just wanted to test Abram to see if Abram is willing to hold nothing back from his mission. And so our calling as Christians today is to count the cost. That's what Jesus says. If we're going to follow him, we have to count the cost, to take up our cross and follow him. And every aspect of our life has to be given to God, has to be surrendered to God, and trust in his promise that he is working through us to bring salvation and redemption to all of creation. And as Pastor Brent said on Sunday, faith allows us to experience the provision of the promise of God. If you want to experience the blessing of being used by God, if you want to experience the blessings of God, then you have to exercise faith. You have to be willing to give everything you have to God to be used by him. So I thank you for watching this week. I will be posting something on Sunday for our live stream. Tune in, join us. There'll be more information coming out about that, how you can do that. And we just encourage you to be a part of this body as we continue to meet together, even though not in a physical form. We're meeting together in community and in spirit, united by the Spirit of God. And I'm so thankful to each of you to be part of our church and part of what we're doing here and what God's building in Focus Church.